For 2 decades, she sat on the same bench every Sunday, never explaining why. Then one stranger sat beside her and shattered everything she thought she knew. Every Sunday afternoon, just as the sun began to filter through the canopy of the old oak tree, Margaret arrived. Coat buttoned no matter the season, a soft scarf wrapped neatly at her throat. Her hair, now silver with time, was pulled back into a loose bun, and her pale blue eyes scanned the winding path before her, with a gaze that lingered longer than most. The townsfolk had stopped wondering long ago. To them, she was simply the bench lady, the quiet older woman who claimed the same spot on the same bench at the same hour every Sunday. Children waved to her, joggers nodded politely, but no one ever asked why she came, not anymore. Margaret never brought a book, never a friend. Only a small leather handbag resting on her lap, and in her gloved hands a worn photograph. The edges curled, the color faded, but the man's face was still clear. Handsome, young, dressed in a military uniform. A hint of a smile played at his lips as if he'd just turned to speak to her. Her thumb moved across the photo's surface like muscle memory, tracing the line of his jaw, the brim of his cap. It had been 20 years, but she hadn't missed a single Sunday. And though she never spoke of him, not to strangers, not to passers-by, those who looked closely could see it. In the way her shoulders tensed each time someone approached from the path. In the way her breath paused, just for a moment before she exhaled and looked away again. The photograph, to them, meant nothing. But to Margaret, it was a promise still waiting to be kept. Long before she became the bench lady, Margaret had been the kind of woman who laughed easily. Her younger self, barefoot in the grass, curls tumbling loose in the summer wind, once danced through this very park. And always, just a step behind, was James. He was everything her world said she shouldn't want. A black man from the working class, soft-spoken but sharp, with warm eyes and a quiet confidence that made her feel both safe and seen. Their love hadn't begun with fireworks, but with quiet moments, him handing her a book she didn't know she needed, or her fixing his tie with a grin before his job interviews. She'd known what her family would say. Her father, a man of old money and older beliefs, never hid his disdain. "He's beneath you, Margaret," he'd said more than once, sipping brandy behind closed doors. "People will talk, doors will close." But James never let it show. He smiled at her father, shook his hand, looked him in the eye with dignity that made her proud. Still, tension hung over them like a storm cloud. When James finally asked her to marry him, she said yes without hesitation, but with a lump in her throat she couldn't swallow, because she knew what it would cost. The last time she saw him, James had asked for a meeting with her father. "Man to man," he'd said, "I need to do this the right way." Margaret kissed him on the cheek, joking that he shouldn't let her father intimidate him. "I'll meet you back here in an hour," she'd said. He never returned. She waited. That entire evening on the bench. Then the next day. Then a week. Her father's story was cold and matter-of-fact. He left, said he wasn't willing to ruin your future, you're better off. No emotion, no apology. She screamed. She cried. She searched. James's apartment was cleared out. His phone disconnected. No one knew where he had gone, or if they did, they weren't saying. Years passed. Her life moved on, but only on paper. She smiled when required, attended charity galas, even tried dating once or twice. But the laughter never reached her eyes again. Then, 1 year after James vanished, a postcard arrived. No return address, no name, just one sentence. "I'm sorry I failed you." She clutched it to her chest like a wound. The handwriting was familiar, curling. At the edges, the way James wrote when he was in a rush. But without proof, she couldn't be sure. Still, she kept it, tucked it inside the frame of his photograph, carried it to the bench every Sunday. Because some part of her, however foolish, refused to let go of the possibility that love didn't just disappear, not without reason, not without a fight. The sun filtered gently through the canopy of oak branches, dappling the old bench in shifting patches of gold and shadow. Margaret sat in her usual place, a thermos of lukewarm tea by her side, the same faded photograph resting delicately in her lap. James in uniform, smiling with a kind of ease she hadn't seen in decades. Her fingers idly traced the worn edges of the picture, the ink almost ghosting from years of quiet devotion. Another Sunday. Another hour of watching. She didn't expect anything to change. It never did. That was until someone sat down beside her. She barely registered the presence at first. People often passed, sometimes paused, but rarely lingered. This man, though, he didn't speak. He simply settled into the far side of the bench, careful not to disturb her quiet bubble. He looked about 30-something, tall and broad-shouldered, with deep brown skin and calm eyes that scanned the park like he knew it too well. His jeans were faded but clean, his shirt crisp. There was something respectful, almost reverent, about the way he sat, as if the bench itself held a kind of sacred weight. Margaret, by instinct, turned slightly away, but after a minute she felt his gaze, soft, not invasive. Then he spoke, his voice low, steady. "Are you waiting for James?" The photograph nearly slipped from her hand. She turned sharply, eyes wide, her heart thudding against her ribs. What did you say?" His gaze didn't waver. "James," he repeated gently. "The man in your photo." Her breath caught. No one in this park knew his name. She had never spoken it aloud here, not in 20 years. She studied him now. Really looked. He had kind eyes, almost too old for his face. A quiet sadness lingered behind his calm expression. There was something about the curve of his jaw, the way he held his hands in his lap, almost like James. But she pushed the thought aside. Coincidence, surely. "Who are you?" she asked cautiously. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked down at his hands, then reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small silver ring, worn but intact, and slipped it off his finger. He held it toward her. "I think you might recognize this." Margaret leaned closer, her fingers trembling as they hovered above the ring. It bore an insignia, a delicate etching of 2 interlocking letters surrounded by laurel leaves. Her eyes widened. It was the same emblem James wore on his class ring. She remembered tracing it once with her fingertip while they lay under the stars, dreaming aloud about their future. This can't be," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Where did you get this?" Caleb's voice was quieter now. "It was passed to me." Margaret's mind raced. Emotions collided. Confusion, fear, hope, suspicion. She stared at him. "You knew him?" Caleb nodded slowly. "More than you might think." He didn't explain, not yet, but he didn't walk away either. And Margaret, for the first time in years, didn't want to be alone on the bench. She clutched the photograph tighter, heart pounding in her chest. The air felt heavier and yet charged with something she hadn't felt in a long time. Possibility. A stranger had just said James's, name out loud, and somehow the world suddenly felt different. Margaret sat stiffly on the bench, her hands clutching her handbag as if anchoring herself to something solid. The man, Caleb, had shattered a delicate silence she'd preserved for 20 years, and now he sat beside her, holding a ring that once belonged to James, speaking his name like it was something sacred. The photograph trembled in her lap. "I need to know," she said, her voice firmer now, rising just above a whisper. "Who are you?" Caleb looked out across the park, the breeze stirring the leaves above them. For a moment, he didn't answer. Margaret watched the muscles in his jaw tighten, his eyes darken with memory. "I'm no one important," he said. At last, "I'm not family, not by blood anyway, but I owe him everything." Her breath hitched. "You knew James?" He nodded slowly. "Not when he was young. I met him much later, at a halfway house just outside of Atlanta. I was 17, angry, tired, running out of second chances. He was working there, volunteer coordinator, though no one knew his real story. He took me in, taught me how to fix old radios, made me read books before dinner, Didn't treat me like trash even when I acted like it. Margaret listened, heart aching. She imagined James, older, maybe grayer, still giving. I always wondered, she said, her voice cracking, if he was alive. If he ever thought about me. Caleb turned to her. He never stopped. Then, carefully, he reached into the inside pocket of his worn jacket. From it, he pulled a folded envelope, yellowed, creased, fragile with age. He handed it to her. Without a word. Margaret's hands trembled as she took it. Her eyes scanned the front, no address. No postage. Just one word in handwriting she hadn't seen since she was a girl. Margaret. Her breath caught. She opened the letter slowly, reverently, as though it might turn to dust in her fingers. The ink was faint, but legible. My dearest Margaret, don't know if you'll ever see this. I'm writing from a place I never imagined I'd be for a crime I didn't commit. They said I threatened your father, that I got violent. I didn't, but it didn't matter. He had power. I didn't. I never wanted to leave you. I never chose that. But once they locked me away, once the silence grew too loud, I realized they'd win either way. I couldn't hurt you more by staying in your life with a record that would follow you. So I disappeared. I carry your face in my mind every single day. The sound of your laugh, the way you called me James Henry when you were mad. It's all I had in that cell. All I have still. If someone ever finds this and gives it to you, then I hope it means I was right to hold on. You were the best. Part of my life, always James. By the time she reached the bottom, tears blurred the words into soft, bleeding lines. Her chest ached as she pressed the paper to her heart, a low sound escaping her lips. Part sob, part sigh, the kind that had waited decades to be released. I thought he walked away, she whispered, that he chose to leave. My father told. He said James left without a word. Caleb's expression hardened. Your father had connections, friends in law enforcement, lawyers. They made it disappear, had the arrest sealed. James didn't even have a trial, just pled down to avoid a longer sentence. Margaret shook her head in disbelief. He was innocent. He was black, Caleb said quietly, and he was dating you. The truth settled between them like ash. Margaret closed her eyes, shoulders trembling. So many years spent blaming herself. So many Sunday afternoons wondering what she had done wrong, why love could feel so permanent only to vanish like vapor. I would have fought for him, she said, her voice trembling. I would have. Caleb nodded. I think he knew that, but he also knew what your father was capable of. James was proud. He didn't want you dragged through that mess. Margaret stared at the letter in her lap. The paper trembled in the wind, fragile and alive with ghosts. Did he ever talk about me? She asked softly. Caleb smiled faintly. He kept a photo of you. One of those little square ones. Said it was taken on your birthday at a lake. You were wearing a blue dress and laughing at something out of frame. She gasped. I remember that day. He said he kept it in his wallet, even when it was falling apart. Margaret pressed her hands to her face, muffling the sob that tore from her throat. She hadn't cried like this in years, hadn't let herself. Beside her, Caleb stayed silent, steady. He didn't reach out. He just sat there, offering quiet presence like a bridge between past and present. It was the first time she felt she wasn't waiting alone. Not anymore. The park had grown quieter now, the sun beginning its slow descent behind the trees, painting golden streaks across the bench where Margaret and Caleb sat. Two souls from different worlds, drawn together by one man's memory. Margaret clutched the letter in her lap as if it were something holy. Her eyes were red-rimmed, the lines on her face etched deeper now. Not from age, but from the weight of a truth too long hidden. She turned to Caleb slowly. Where is he now? There was a pause before Caleb answered. His voice was low, reverent. He passed away 5 years ago. The words hit like a cold wind. Margaret's lips parted, but no sound came. Her breath caught in her throat. He died in prison, Caleb continued, quietly. No visitors, no family came to claim him. Just a man with a name that no one remembered, except me. Margaret's hand went to her mouth. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no. I'm sorry," Caleb said softly. "I wish I could have brought you better news. I really do." Tears slipped freely down her cheeks now. She shook her head as if trying to undo the words, as if denial might reverse time. "All these years," she murmured. "I thought I had time. That maybe, just maybe, he'd walk through that gate and sit down beside me like nothing ever happened." She looked toward the path ahead, eyes distant as if expecting James to step out from between the trees in uniform and smile that crooked smile that used to undo her. "But you found me," she said finally. Why go to all this trouble?" Caleb shifted in his seat, reaching into the pocket of his coat again. "Because he asked me to." He held out another envelope, worn, soft around the edges, but carefully protected. Margaret stared at it before taking it in trembling hands. "I promised him," Caleb said. His exact words were, "Tell her I never stopped loving her. Not once. Not for a day." Margaret opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No salutation, no signature. Just a short message in James's careful handwriting. "I waited for the world to be kind enough to bring us back. Together. It never was. But my love for you never needed the world's permission. It only needed you." Her tears dropped silently onto the page, darkening the ink. But tucked behind the letter was something else. A flower, dried, pressed, delicate as breath. Margaret gasped. It was a tiny sprig of forget-me-not, her favorite, the one she used to tuck behind her ear when she and James would go walking by the lake, just to make him smile. He used to tease her, say she looked like she belonged in a painting. She hadn't worn one since the day he disappeared. Her fingers hovered over the brittle petals. "He remembered," she said, voice cracking. "He remembered everything," Caleb replied. "He used to say your name like a prayer. When the days were long and the nights harder, he'd close his eyes and talk about you. About your laugh. About how you'd hum under your breath when you cooked. About the way you once wrote him a love letter on a napkin and left it in his coat pocket." Margaret let out a soft laugh through her tears. "I thought he never found that note. He kept it," Caleb smiled faintly. "Folded it inside his Bible." Silence fell again, but it was no longer heavy, no longer choked with unknowns. This silence was full of presence, of truth, of James. Margaret turned to Caleb, studying his face. "You were just a boy when you met him." Caleb nodded. "I was a mess. Angry at the world. Angry at my own father. For leaving, I didn't believe in anything but James. He didn't try to fix me. He just saw me. He taught me what it looked like to be good, not loud. To show love in small, consistent ways. To forgive, even when it wasn't asked for." He paused, his voice thickening. "He saved me." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. Then, gently, she reached for his hand. It was calloused, warm, human. "In a way," she said, voice steadying. "He still saved me too." The wind picked up, rustling the leaves overhead. The bench creaked faintly beneath them. In the fading light, the world seemed suspended. 2 lives connected across decades by one man's quiet devotion. Margaret tucked the flower gently into the breast pocket of her coat. Not behind her ear. Not today. This was not a performance of memory, but an act of honoring something sacred. "I'm glad he had you," she whispered. "I think," Caleb said, looking at her with deep, solemn eyes. "He'd say the same about you." As the sky softened into hues of dusk, the bench no longer looked so empty. It had held a vigil, a hope, and now it held closure. A name that had once been erased was now spoken again. James. And love, after all, had remembered. The bench was no longer just a bench. To most passers-by, it was still the same old spot under the sprawling oak, the same wooden seat worn smooth by time and weather. But to Margaret, it had shifted. It no longer held the weight of waiting. It held something gentler now. Memory, honor, release. She came every Sunday still, just as she had for 20 years. But now her posture was different, no longer perched anxiously, eyes sweeping the path in hope. Now she sat with a calm dignity, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze resting not on who might come, but on what had already been. And Caleb came too. Each week without fail he arrived at her side. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't. They would sit for an hour or two, watching the wind stir the leaves above, listening to the sounds of children laughing in the nearby playground. It was no longer about grief. It was about remembering and honoring a man who had shaped both their lives in silence. Margaret still carried the letter in her purse. She had read it so many times the paper had begun to wear thin. But she could not let it go. The weight of those words, the quiet apology, the unyielding love, was something she had once longed for and feared she would never receive. Now that she had it, she cherished it. But it wasn't enough to keep James alive in her heart alone. So one Sunday morning, Margaret brought a form and a pen. "I've spoken to the Parks Department," she told Caleb softly. "They said I could petition for a plaque." Caleb turned toward her, curious. "A plaque?" she smiled. "For the bench. I wanted to say something, simple, something true." He nodded, moved. "What will it say?" Margaret looked down at the paper in her lap. Her fingers trembled slightly as she traced the inscription she had written in careful cursive. "For those whose love outlived silence." It wasn't flashy. It didn't name James, it didn't name her, but it carried the truth, their truth, a love that endured abandonment, injustice, and time itself, not with bitterness, but with patience, with grace. Weeks later, the small bronze plaque was affixed to the bench. Children who came to the park would often notice it, their curious eyes drawn to the shimmer of metal in the morning sun. Some would ask her what it meant. One day, a little girl with pigtails and a pink dress tugged at Margaret's sleeve. "Why? Do you come here every Sunday?" Margaret smiled, her eyes soft. "Because once a very kind man loved me more than the world would allow." The girl tilted her head. "Is that why you used to look sad?" "Yes," Margaret said, "but now I remember him, and that makes me smile." The girl nodded, satisfied, and skipped away. Caleb chuckled from beside her. "That's the simplest explanation I've ever heard." "Sometimes," Margaret said, "simple is enough." They sat in comfortable silence after that, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows from the trees. The bench, now etched with meaning, had become a quiet monument, not just to love but to resilience, to forgiveness, to the idea that not all stories need to end in reunions to be complete. Some just need to be told, some just need to be heard, and some, like James's, need only to be remembered, with love that no longer waits but simply is. Margaret sat in the quiet of her living room, sunlight pouring through the lace curtains, casting soft golden patterns on the floor. Her hands were steady as she pressed the letter, James's letter, into a simple wooden frame. The edges of the paper were delicate now, corners curling with time, but the ink remained strong, just like his words, just like his love. She placed the frame on the mantel above the fireplace right next to the faded photograph they had taken in the summer of '66, her with a flower tucked behind her ear, James with his arm around her shoulders, both of them smiling like the world hadn't yet gotten in the way. It had taken her years to understand that silence didn't mean absence, that love, even when stripped of touch and time, could still echo through decades. And now she was ready to speak back, not in bitterness, not in sorrow, but in truth. Margaret opened her journal and began to write, not a diary, not a confession, but a memoir. A chronicle of love that had been buried by power, of a man who had been erased by design but lived on in memory, and of her own journey from waiting to understanding. She didn't call it the love that waited. She called it the love that never left. Months later, at a small community event in the heart of the city, people gathered in folding chairs under soft string lights. A local bookstore had offered to host the reading. There were neighbors, a few old friends, and strangers drawn by the quiet buzz of a love story that had outlived the noise. Caleb stood at the small wooden podium, dressed in a dark blue button-down shirt and slacks. His voice was calm, deep, and warm as he read the final paragraph of Margaret's memoir. I waited for 20 years not knowing what I was truly waiting for, but when the truth came, it didn't return as a man from the past. It came as a voice carrying his memory, as a young soul shaped by his kindness. And in that, James lived on. Some people never stop loving. Some truths never stay buried. The audience was silent, not a silence of emptiness, but of reverence. Margaret sat in the front row, her white hair softly curled, hands clasped around a handkerchief in her lap. Her eyes glistened, but she wasn't crying. Not anymore. She was proud. She was whole. When the applause came, it was gentle, rising like a tide, not for pity, not for drama, but for a life reassembled by love and truth.